Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture from the Australian Learning Lecture. I'm Martin Westwell, I'm the Chief Executive of the SACE Board, and joining me is Peter Mader, the Chief Executive of the South Australian Secondary Principals Association. Welcome educators from across South Australia, the Northern Territory and beyond. Also brought to you with prescience of the SACE Board's professional learning arm. I'd also like to welcome Chelsea, our Auslan interpreter, who's going to be joining us this afternoon. Gana Miana Wangandi Mani Nabudni Gana Yatana Nadlu Dampindi Gana Miana Yata Matanya Wama Dadanyaku. The Ghana people say welcome to Ghana country, and we recognise the Ghana people are the landowners and custodians of the Adelaide Plains.
Martin, we've got an audience today that includes other members of the Australian educational community. So we've got people joining us from elsewhere in South Australia, from Northern Territory and New South Wales. So on behalf of those people, I'd just like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of their First Nations people, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. Good afternoon, everyone. By joining us, you've indicated your interest in the important work that Valerie Hannon is doing globally around forging a new education paradigm, one where schools are operating as future-fit ecosystems. And you're very much a part of that ecosystem. And you know, as Valerie does, that the future young people face holds many known and unknown challenges. And to navigate this terrain, we'll need them to become thriving lifelong learners. As Valerie will share with us this afternoon, if students are able to do this, they'll not only meet the many challenges ahead, they'll actually be very active in creating a much better future. We want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. If you're logged in, please use the chat function. If not logged in, can you use the Google form to submit a question? We'll be going to the video in a moment of Valerie's presentation, and you'll see Martin and I at the end of that, and we'll be able to share those questions with Valerie on your behalf. So Martin, you and I have very great pleasure in sharing with you Valerie Hannon's Australian Learning lecture, Seeing is Believing, the Future School is Here.
Back in 2019 BC, that's before COVID, I was invited by the Australian Learning Lecture to consider the nature of the future school. I'd like to record my thanks to the Foundation for this opportunity, and I'd also like to express my admiration for the extraordinary contribution of Ellen Koshland in advancing Australian education. In doing this work, I found remarkable schools around the world well advanced in the work of creating institutions fit for the future. COVID interrupted that work and the work of every human on Earth. And the impact of COVID on schools will remain ambiguous, I think, for some years to come. Now, some people are understandably desperate to get their old lives back, to snap back to things as they were. Others see this as an extraordinary opportunity to step back and to ask ourselves some long overdue fundamental questions. I believe that it's vital that we seize this opportunity, that we don't just wait to slide back into the old patterns and habits and structures. Rather, we should be thinking about the longer term plans we can lay now to transform our schooling systems to be future fit. And the good news? We now have an immense number of examples to help us, a kind of global prototyping lab from which to learn. Seeing is believing. But if you were to be asked to pick out which schools should provide our guides, how would you go about it? Well, my thinking process went like this. There are evolving new models of schools around the world, but suggesting which provide models for the future can't just be a matter of personal opinion. A good way in is to look first at the organisations that focus on the future itself. How is it shaping up, and what does this mean for schools? My research showed that you can distill out of the work of such organisations sets of design principles for creating schools fit for the future. So the second step was identifying those principles. My research then looked at schools across the world that were using those principles in their work, with some remarkably encouraging outcomes. We look at future-focused schools in diverse settings, from California to Delhi, from New Zealand to Spain. There's a database of around 50, there could have been many more. And we explore the thinking that has led to their establishment, the practical new models that have resulted, and we consider what they might have to teach us about what a new normal could look like. One that is focused on creating the future the next generation needs. And out of that, some very interesting other patterns emerged. In this brief talk, I'm going to share these research findings with you and then make some suggestions about how to go forward. If this captures your interest, and I very much hope that it will, a short paper is available to you after this lecture, and a book will be forthcoming, we hope, early in the new year. Now, before getting stuck in, let me say, though, that one of the outcomes of the COVID catastrophe has been a resurgence of the view that the school as an institution has had its day, that the long-delayed promise of EdTech is about to be fulfilled. Soon, we won't need schools anymore, and EdTech will do to the institution of school what Amazon has done to shopping. Maybe the growth of pandemic pods will fuel this idea. Well, I passionately reject this suggestion, whilst I recognise that it is a possibility. As I'll argue later, the social institution of school is a vital component in thriving communities and in fostering the well-being of young people, if the institution is redesigned. And that redesign is even more imperative if we want our institutions to drive towards equity, as opposed to entrenching existing inequalities. So the beginning of my research journey was to review the global organizations that intentionally employ forms of futures thinking as a tool to support policy. In case you believe that futures thinking is an irrelevant academic activity, let's get clear. The future just kicked the door down. We can't assume steady state continuity with the past. There are discernible trends and also disruptions that profoundly impact the nature of life on Earth, and schools need to shape up to that reality. So here is the set of 23 organizations we looked at who intentionally factor in thinking about the nature of the future into their work on learning. No doubt there are more out there. Now, you can see they are diverse, ranging from intergovernmental research agencies to challenge prize sponsors to think tanks. And out of this review, it was possible then to distill sets of design principles of future-focused schools that were held in common, though they were sometimes expressed differently. These design principles form the heart of my findings, and they are the key practical takeaway for educators and leaders. They fall into three clusters. First, I found design principles that focus on values that future schools should manifest, on the operational philosophy that demonstrate those values in practice, and on the learner's experience of all of that. First then, values. Our surveyed organizations all privileged some key values for future schools in their work. Perhaps this reflects the fact that something important has been lost, a North Star. This is not to deny that many school leaders do already focus or try to focus on this issue, in some contexts finding it very difficult to do so in their prevailing accountability regimes. In looking at the initiatives in our dataset, we found the following design principles relating to the concept of values. First, purpose-driven. Future schools are themselves focused on the purpose of both individual and collective thriving, and on helping their learners to acquire personal purpose, building their why. Equity-focused. Such schools should work to address inequities and social justice and help young people to do so. Third, promoting identity. And this principle suggests that each learner's social and cultural identity must be nurtured, cultivating a sense of belonging and of value. Next, strength-based. This principle asserts that The school recognizes and celebrates and builds from each and every individual's existing assets. Finally, relevant. And this proposes that learning be relevant to the local and the global community. Work that matters should be an important feature. The second set of principles focuses on operational philosophy. Values mean nothing if their force is not felt in translation to practice. So the organizations we looked at had assembled clear principles in this domain. They were, first, learning focused. Learning is at the heart. So understanding how learning happens, the very best in research on learning sciences, underpin developments. And this applies to adult learning of all staff as well. Now, this is a critically important principle, and it is not axiomatic by any means in all schools today. Next, flexible and dynamic. The school should flexibly iterate different modes of teaching and learning to meet the evolving needs of learners and the wider world, to be agile, if you like. In an age of disruption, this is an imperative, as schools found out in 2020. Next, technology enhanced. Future schools use technology extensively and responsibly to liberate learning, amplify effective and diverse modalities, and to enable both personalization and collaboration. And finally, ecosystemic. This principle asserts the school should be seriously porous with many active partners in organizing learning. It will be deeply connected to its local community and also to the global community through technology to provide richer learning experiences and diverse pathways for learners. And then the third cluster. That focuses on learners' experience of all the previous principles. And that, of course, is crucial, because what's it like to be on the receiving end? We found a strong awareness of this issue in many of the organizations we surveyed, and it's reflected in the following principles. First, personalized. The learner's experience relates to her personal needs, passions, and development. These are at the center, not the institution, the teacher, or external bodies of knowledge. Next, integrated. The learner experiences meaning through learning that transcends silos, building relevant connections both within and between disciplines. Inclusive. The culture is experienced as respectful and welcoming. Relational. Individuals are known. Good relationships are the basis for deep learning. Collaboration is the norm. And finally, empowering. Future schools build and leverage learner agency, providing opportunities for learners to take increasing responsibility and ownership over their learning. Now, I would be very surprised if any of these were completely unfamiliar to you. But ask yourself how often you see them fully realized and combined. Taken together, they give the coordinates of the new model. They aren't a recipe, they are the ingredients. And it's inspiring to see how schools across the world are combining and emphasizing them differently. When we compiled a database of schools that were utilizing these principles, and the book describes many of them in some depth, we also noticed another pattern emerging. Many of the schools utilizing these principles were also addressing some of the key challenges and opportunities of our time. The mission, of course, was for the benefit of their own young people, but they also had the big global issues in mind. And we found 6 areas where schools had explicitly and intentionally determined to make a difference to the future, and they were employing the design principles to help them do it. The first is that of schools aiming to grow ethical leadership. Such schools give primacy to the notion that the future demands new kinds of leadership, ethical, democratized. Here is Jeff Holt, who runs the Liger Leadership Academy in Phnom Penh, a school shaped to create the leaders the future needs. This is a country ravaged by a traumatic past.
We take very seriously our goals. We call them leadership competencies, and it's things like vision and influence, about networking, about problem solving, about communication and collaboration, and dot connecting, being able to connect dots and solve problems, being able to understand how one thing impacts another thing. And that is really the basis for our whole curriculum. So it's not just an add-on, as many people talk about, but those kinds of competencies, these leadership competencies, are skills that will bring them into the future. And in particular, our students in Cambodia, in the next 20 or 30 years, we believe these literally are the skills that they need to create a better economy and a better country. But in addition to that, we also think about their future skills, not only of just competencies like being able to network, being able to communicate effectively and so on, but also who people are. The ethics and the values that people hold are very important to us, and it's very important in Cambodia to rebuild people that are leaders that have strong value systems and that really understand, that are globally minded, understand the world, and care about other people. So we do things that are real world projects. We have a group of students that are working on marine biology in the coast off of Cambodia. They have become the first certified scuba divers in the country, and they are working with people, with researchers from all over the world to try to save the habitat off the coast. So this is a 3-year project. So it's very authentic and very real, and it really makes a huge impact. They presented at international conferences. And I give you one example, but I could give you 100 examples of things like that our students are doing. And my point is that when you do things like that, when you are doing things that are authentic, that are real, and that are impactful, that actually make a difference, it is motivating for students. So for the first time really in my whole career, I've seen students be completely engaged in their learning. Every day, they want to make a difference. They want to work on these larger initiatives that can create change. I guess the second part of it is really the idea of the world as a classroom. There are 7 billion people in the world, more than 7 billion people. And we think at Liger that pretty much everyone works together with our students at Liger to learn and work on projects together. So every single day, our students are working with people from all over the world, working with mentors to work on projects. We have a very critical and amazing staff that works with them, but oftentimes we don't really know anything about the project. For example, I'm working on this satellite project with these students. I don't know anything about satellites, but I'll tell you, I know a lot more now, but our students are literally satellite experts because the whole world has opened up. And so really the idea of a teacher at school, we really question the whole notion of who's working, who's helping students learn. But the real answer that we've been working on for years is everyone.
As you heard from Jeff, design principles of purpose, ecosystemic, and empowering are especially important. And this is a fast expanding field. The United World Colleges, Future Nation Schools Africa, Mary L. Booker Leadership Academy, Nova Pioneer Schools, and many others. There seems to be a felt need to address the leadership deficit in this world of ours. Leadership based not on class or wealth or entitlement, but on competence and values. The way in which COVID-19 played out globally threw into sharp relief how critical, wise, competent leadership was. Now, the second archetype is the schools building our technological future. In the Kozen schools in Japan, for example, and schools such as Chungnam Samsung Academy, Korea, or Warana Park here in Australia, we found schools that take as their guiding mission the idea that we need to create young people who are not just consumers, victims, or objects of technology, but rather who combine technological confidence and competence with a value frame that serves humanity. The evolution of this type of school may be a fundamental part of our overall quest to thrive. Naturally, design principles of technology enhanced and learning focus, amongst others, are preeminent. Third, we see schools devoted to our environmental thriving. The Green School in Indonesia, and now also in New Zealand and Mexico, is representative of schools giving primacy to the idea that we have no future unless every child becomes environmentally literate, passionate, and active. At the Green School, the curriculum design is derived from its key principles of relevance, purpose, relational, and of course, ecosystemic. This is a fast expanding category worldwide too. Worldwide examples include the Academy for Global Citizenship in the US, the Muse Schools, California, Forest Schools, and many others. Fourth, we see schools committed to enabling their learners to navigate the fast-changing world of work and employment. This archetype comprises schools that are particularly focused on the idea that the future labour market will be disrupted and volatile, and that to ensure their future prosperity, learners need to become career navigators. There are numerous examples: Latitude School, California, schools in the pioneering Big Picture family across the world, like Launceston here in Tasmania. These make internships a central part of their offer to introduce their learners to multiple models of a working life. We're seeing schools that grow entrepreneurs and change makers. Learn Life Barcelona is representative of the numerous schools now addressing the challenge of growing the world's capacity to create and manage change and innovation. This rapidly growing field is becoming increasingly studied. It includes schools like the Riverside School in Gujarat and Nuvu Studios in the US. These schools are drawing upon design principles for learning that develop the entrepreneurial competencies and the value frame that drives motivation to make change for the common good. The practical impact of those design principles is directly felt. In the case of Learn Life, for example, a very different way of using time and of structuring the working week. Finally, the schools that give particular emphasis to nurturing a sense of identity in their learners. Ngā Tapu Wai in Auckland, New Zealand, is archetypal of schools whose foremost mission is to help young people develop and discover their human identity. And all through school, educating from kindergarten to year 13, the school's ethos is that students need a strong and embedded understanding of themselves as Maori, as a proud and productive people pre- and post-colonization. And this school believes that in order to create successful futures, young people need to discover who they are, together with a sense of belonging. Here is Arahia Sterling, the much honoured principal of the school.
We really need to ensure that our children come from a space where they feel safe about their self-identity, which will improve their self-efficacy because they understand who they are, why they are, where they've come from. That's totally different to just teaching a person something. In terms of us as Māori, we come from quite a broken space, and our children need to understand that you don't need to remain feeling deprived from being Māori. You can actually still be Māori in a much, much better world that recognise their Māoriness. When our students know how important their Māoriness is, then everything's important. So when they know how important their language is, then everything's important. I believe that the future for our students in terms of their identity is far more important, because the world's asking a different type of human being now. And the world is asking for someone that knows how to connect, truly connect with an energy that another person requires you to connect to. And that's what we require in our culture, that you're truly present, that what you're saying is honest, that what you are saying is dignified and it doesn't belittle people, that you check yourself and you be the best part of yourself, because that's what you expect you to be as a Māori person. So when you look at the world and the way in which we need to engage now, it's about relationships. Entrepreneurialism means that the more that you can make someone understand your space and understand that you would be safe in their space and vice versa, is a much more important commodity than handing over a piece of paper with a whole lot of things on it saying that you can be that person. And the new dimensions of education systems is identity, and how valuable it is that every child in the world has one, and how do we capture that to enrich their learning experience and return joy to them.
Let me say clearly, no school is about just one thing. But in this research, I found that first, there are usable, clear design principles available for the future schools, and they are being modelled across the world for educators to explore and adopt or adapt. And second, there is emerging a movement in which schools are engaging themselves deeply in the biggest challenges of our time. They are addressing them head on. They believe schools should no longer exist in a separate bubble. My final observations come back to the issue of leadership. Many, though by no means all, many of the examples of schools we have found that are intentionally working to be future fit are operating outside of the publicly funded systems. Across the world, numerous startups are appearing. A few are state-sponsored, such as in Beijing and Qatar. School chains, utilizing configurations of the design principles described earlier, are multiplying, from United World Colleges, micro schools such as Agile Learning Centres, Quantum Camp, Acton Academy, Round Square, Whittle Schools and Studios, many more. Now, too few such schools are available to the disadvantaged, since so many are fee-paying or independent. And a serious concern is that the most advantaged will access future-facing schools, whilst many schools in the public sector remain constrained by the old paradigm. And it is partly, I think, because the public will has not yet been built to effect a shift, and partly because teachers are not trusted sufficiently to reorient in these directions. Too many schools are stuck in the slow lane. So what can leaders do to bring their systems up to speed? Of course, this isn't just a question for leaders. There's a need for learners and parents too to get proactive. But in addressing this professional audience, I offer 3 ideas which I see as a priority. The first is to build the public will for change. A major blockage to change is politicians' assumptions about what the public wants or will tolerate. But they have a role in creating a different culture of expectation. And the pandemic may help in that, since so much is being re-evaluated. We need new narratives of what education is for and what it can be. The diverse experiences of parents, educators, and young people of the disruption of learning during the pandemic can be a springboard for the development of such narratives. Second, encourage a different professional debate. How might we encourage informed, systematic debate about the school design principles, what they mean, what they're based on, where's the research on how they're best implemented, and what are the practical implications? The set of principles laid out here have been synthesized from the work of some of the key future-focused organizations in an iterative process with innovative practitioners. That doesn't make them comprehensive. No doubt others will arise. So whether as a leader of a system or as a leader within a school, creating learning communities committed to exploring future-focused design could become a priority. And then creating the conditions where the selected principles can be systematically enacted in practice authentically. This is what creates the school fit for the future. What's important is to show how this is doable and with powerful effect. Third, become leaders who really lead. System leaders, the public servants, sometimes pejoratively termed bureaucrats, they have a particularly crucial role in offering real leadership. They need to enrich the ideas pool and the evidence upon which politicians can rely. And they need an unbureaucratic mindset, more outward-looking, more curious, and open to new developments. Informed by design principles, they need to be more willing to consider different uses of time and space, people, and technology. In closing, let me say this. A school of the future should not be imagined as, on the one hand, adjuncts of the powerful new technologies, nor even as new community centres. I believe we need to see them as a fundamental element in the range of new solutions humankind must evolve if we are to overcome and transcend the existential challenges that confront us. Schools have by no means outlived their usefulness. On the contrary, they are vital institutions, but only if they're redesigned. An environmental revolution that saves our habitat and our existence upon it. A transformed approach to other species, genuinely democratic, equitable societies, personal well-being. None of this is achievable unless we develop institutions that are explicitly aimed at bigger objectives than heretofore. It's about the development of new humans. In short, it's about how we are to thrive. And I believe that transformed schools are key to achieving this vision for our futures. And I know now there are schools who are intent on doing it. With the right leadership, it can become every school's journey.
Valerie, it is so good to see you again, even though you're sitting on the other side of the world. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, this morning, and updating us on your work.
Martin, Peter, it's great to see you. I wish I were there, truthfully. It's dark. It's very early in the morning, and yeah, I miss people, but hey, great to see you.
Yeah, you too. And again, I'll say thanks as well, especially because it's 6 o'clock in the morning where you are. So we are very grateful that you can join us at such an early hour. But Valerie, I mean, this has been a fantastic journey that you've been on, seeing such a broad range of schools and innovation and just that kind of positive impact on young people. But I'm sure you will have seen some surprises when you were looking at these schools and working with these schools. What surprised you the most? What did you see that kind of really lifted you or really shocked you, perhaps, when you were working with these schools?
Well, Martin, let me say, first of all, I'd love to say that I've been working with them. But the truth is I haven't. Well, no, that's not true. I have with some of them I do know personally and have visited, but by no means all. So this work is fundamentally desk research and interviews at distance for all the reasons that we all know so well. So I would love to have the opportunity to spend a bit more time in each and every one of them, actually. But to your question about surprises, just to take you back to methodology, so I didn't just have in my head a preset idea of what would be in the data set. I needed a methodology that had some rigor to it, and it wasn't just my personal opinion, you know, because I think that's really problematic. So as I said, the methodology was to say, well, where in the world are there institutions, and there were a variety of them, think tanks, government agencies, university research centres, challenge prize sponsors, who had been doing work on futures and who had some views about what schools for the future needed to evince, what kinds of bases they needed to go forward. And that in turn was drawn from a kind of an iterative response relationship with schools. So I've got 23 of those organisations and I looked at their work. Now the surprises in there, I think, and of course the way in which I've expressed the principles is drawn upon the work of those organisations, but I've had to synopsize, you know, it's using different language in order to make it accessible. I think I've done my very best to be faithful and to be truthful to what they were trying to get at. But the surprises in there, I think, were firstly, the emphasis that all of them put on values. So they didn't plunge straight into issues about pedagogy and curriculum and assessment, you know, the places that we usually start. When they think about the future, they say, well, actually, you've got to get your value frame straight. And the second thing that surprised me about that was how many of them went into the issue of identity and promoting identity for young people. And truthfully, I had never really thought about that. We tended to use the word personalized in a kind of a blanket, fuzzy sort of way. But actually emerging from my review of the work of these organizations, the issue of identity, and it's a really complex one because it's not, I think somebody put it well, it's not a destination, it's not a thing, it's more a verb and it's a journey of exploration, trying to find out who you are. I found that really interesting. And then when I turned to the schools to try to find schools who were modeling these principles, that came through really strongly. So that's one thing. I think some of the principles I would have guessed at before I went into research, but some kind of surprised me. I think that was one. And also the other principle, I guess, that surprised me in the learner's experience, this won't surprise South Australians who really work hard on this, I know, is the whole issue of it being relational, how relationships are fundamental to all of this. And my God, have we seen that manifested through lockdown and what it's revealed to us. So those were the things that sort of took me aback a bit, I think. And then the second thing that surprised me was when we looked at the data set. So we had all these schools. I can't remember how many are in the database now, something like 60. And honestly, that was just constrained by time. I mean, I could spend a lifetime doing this, and I would love to in a sense. When I looked at those, it's, they're using these design principles in a kind of mix and match because it's to do with context and to do with intention. So what's the pattern that's emerging? And that's when this pattern of archetypes started to emerge. Schools were saying, we care about a lot of these things. We're not about just one thing, but we do have a big overarching mission that we want to make a difference on in the world. And hence the 6 archetypes that came out at the end. And what I think that demonstrates for me is that it's like, I was going to say schools coming out the closet, but that's not quite the right expression. It's schools coming out and saying, we are a part of remaking this world of ours. And you guys are old enough as me to remember conferences where you went along and people said, well, it's clear what schools are for. It's about learning how to learn. Maybe we've all said it. And you know what? It's absolutely not just about that. That's completely inadequate because it's about for what? Mm-hmm. And each of these schools in their particular context is saying, well, we want to make a big contribution to the world. And whether it's about creating new kinds of leaders, whether it's about enabling people to become environmental activists, because if we don't, we are done for. Whether it's about becoming proactive in the remaking of technology for human purposes, not just sitting on the end and being users. So those notions of the archetypes, if you'd asked me to begin with, I wouldn't have said they existed, and they absolutely do. And the foci that they've chosen, I think, are really important, really significant. And I don't use this word often, I was seriously inspired by seeing what schools are doing.
Thanks, Valerie. And one of the things that you've reminded us of is the importance of context. And sadly, what's happened in the UK and the United States with regards to COVID compared to what's happened here in Australia has been contextually different. Yep. So we're really interested in being part of a movement that changes what we do in schools, aligned to what you've shared with us this afternoon. So in thinking about our context and building the will for change, what recommendation would you give to us given the imperative that may exist in the UK and the United States is not necessarily in the foreground here in Australia?
Absolutely not. And I feel a little embarrassed that you're asking me for advice. I'm kind of, I want to say to you that South Australia punches above its weight, and your reputation seriously goes before you now, so that in any global conversations that I'm involved in on this, South Australia's work comes up, and you are seen as leaders in the field and creating the right kind of context for change. So let me say that straight off the bat. And one of the things that you're doing that I think are absolutely spot on, well, they include, and by the way, this applies at the kind of system level, and I think it applies at the institutional level as well. I do hope we get some questions from principals and institutional leaders. But I said there were 3 pieces of advice, or synthesized observation, if you like, that I think are relevant here. You've already referred to building the public will for change. Well, how do you get about that? I think it's through creating the right conversations, starting from where people are at, not hitting them overhead with a baseball bat, but rather acknowledging that we're all trying to work in the same direction here and scaffolding the right kinds of conversations by scaffolding, I mean bringing the right kind of provocations, the right kind of evidence base. But somebody said to me the other day, I was doing a WISE seminar, and they said, what's the thing that you've learned most in the last 4 or 5 years? And I actually think that I've learned that stories and narrative are more important than logic and data. And this goes against the grain, because that's not how I'm wired. It's not actually fundamentally who I am. But the fact is that really great leaders can tell stories, pointed stories, purposeful stories that illuminate these things and affect people, because it's the affect that's so important, I think, that can make all the difference. So if I would think about what you're already doing and how to take it forward, scaffold the right conversations, bring to that work really inspiring examples, both from within the state and beyond it, and say, what have we got that we can build on further and further and further incrementally? And I happen to know that you're already well down that path, so I really don't feel that I'm offering you anything new. Rather, I sit at your feet and learn from you.
Valerie, it seems that watching some of the videos there of the school, so I'm looking at the Liger Institute, and they seem to be talking about that learning as a system rather than perhaps as a linear, one step after another that we sometimes see in education, the connection across talking about the joining the dots.
Yes.
And so that's making me wonder about things like the nature of evidence that we provide in assessment, going away from the kind of narrow to the broad to the narrative and the conversations. And Bryony Forster's asked a question as well that I think is connected, which is about, what does it mean to be a teacher then in 2021 and beyond? Is it about knowing how to knowing how to find out rather than recalling content, maybe getting into that more system than linear? What are your reflections on that?
Well, I think Bryony's nailed it by the way she's framed the question, of course. It's about being a leader and learn. And, I think some teachers are somewhat concerned that moving down this path, in a sense, reduces the reliance upon their expertise, or in some sense denudes what the role of the teacher is. On the contrary, it absolutely does the reverse of that. I think it underlines the sophistication of the role in the future, and that leadership of learning, as Bryony's as she's framed it there. I could use other metaphors like being a choreographer. If you're a choreographer, you need to know dance inside out. And it's about shaping the learning experience, drawing upon your own subject expertise, insofar as that goes. And of course, we now know with the explosion of knowledge, no teacher can be absolutely up to date with the latest developments in whatever it is. It's in physics or biochemistry or even in the arts, actually, because these things are moving at such a pace. So the role of the teacher is to build upon their own subject expertise, but to bring into the piece the other sources of learning, which thankfully through this extraordinary technology we are capable of doing. And I was really struck by the way Jeff Holt, in that interview, by the way, all those videos are taken from much longer videos, which I think are really absorbing. And I know that the Australian Learning Lecture intends making them available to people so they can think about that even further. But I was really struck in that video in which Jeff Holt of Liger Leadership Academy said, we asked ourselves who were the teachers, and then we suddenly realized it's the whole world. Because we can bring the whole world in, and we can take our young people out. So, one of the organizations we surveyed to get the learning principles, Education Reimagined, always talks about wall-less schools. So the permeability of the school, in which the teacher is, here you get more metaphors, navigator, choreographer, leader of learning, shaping that. A lot of which will be done within the classroom, but increasingly more outside of it. More, hybrid forms, of course, in which young people use their own technology in creative ways. But I want to say this, as I've got the floor to throw it in. Maybe I should have put it under surprises as well. I came away from this work more passionately committed to the idea of the school as an institution, a face-to-face institution,
Such an important message, Valerie. Look, you mentioned in the lecture that we live in the age of disruption, but we also in education live in the age of measurement. So we've got a question here from Kate Searson, who's asked that within that context, how can we be empowered to undertake values development in our schools?
Well, we are in an age of measurement, and the important thing is to measure what we value. By the way, not everything has to be measured. If you wanted to say from the outset, what's the most important thing in the world? Love, undoubtedly. Love for our planet, love for each other, you know. Is that a debate? No. And do we measure that? We do not. So let's put that principle down to begin with. Not everything that's of value does need to get measured. However, it is important that if we are spending time measuring things, then we do value them. And you know, you now have to question how valuable it is to be able to recall to short-term memory vast swathes of particular subject areas. You could say there is a sort of value in that, for sure. I don't want my doctor having to look things up on Google every time I walk in her door. I want to know some stuff, thank you. And measuring that she is competent in a range of subject areas and processes and procedures is very important. I think it's about getting these things in balance, really. And I do think that a sign that we will be moving in the right direction, a sign, an indicator, if you like, of systemic shift, will be when systems really start to ask hard questions about what it is that they have been measuring and therefore valuing, and the system that elevates that to what everybody attends to, because it, you know, tends to be what you incentivize and what you reward. And I think, therefore, that as an indicator that a system is really being thoughtful about that and wanting to make a shift is when it puts a sharp lens of interrogation upon its assessment system and says, community, guys, let's get this right. Let's make sure this system of assessment is of service to learners and is of service to the community, because assessment has to fulfill many functions, from systemic functions, you know, around accountability, and that is important, but then right through down to liberating and empowering and enabling learners to be more powerful learners. Now, when systems start to ask themselves that question and start to devise better answers, then we know we're, I think, on the right path.
Valerie, your point about assessment is a really good one. In fact, we've got a statement, and it's been directed at me, but I'm going to redirect it back to you about how it would be wonderful to work closely with the SACE, especially in the sciences, this person's saying, to look at assessment alternatives and to give schools confidence to try new things. Of course, once we get to that kind of senior secondary level and students are making that transition out of schooling into their next steps, they want to go with some evidence of their learning, some evidence of the skills, the knowledge, perhaps their capabilities, some dispositions. What did you see in this work that was useful, that the community was seeing value in the evidence that students were taking into their next step beyond school?
It wasn't a very, I'll be perfectly frank, Martin, and say it wasn't a very sharp lens for interrogation in the period of time that we had. The canvas was so broad, it was rather difficult to, dig down in that kind of way. But my observations, I think, would be that we saw schools looking at wider approaches to assessment. So your point about learners have a right, let's get clear, entitlement to have that recognition of learning after all that time spent in school, and they need it to be able to demonstrate their readiness to move on to whatever field is going to be. I mean, I would say I think that one shift has got to be around a rather reducing focus on the academics solely, so that's the only measure of any form of capability. And the attempt by schools, obviously through innovations like portfolios, like micro-credentialing, like the mastery transcript. I mean, many of the schools that we looked at in the US, very interested in the mastery transcripts consortium and that movement, which, by the way, and I just want to add in there that too often I think the kind of gold standard or the baseline that these things are valid and authentic is whether universities will accept them. And you know what? That's one, but it's not the only one. They're not. Universities aren't God. We don't have to. I mean, the dialogue with the universities is terribly important, and the creation of new pathways is incredibly important. I don't want to be cynical about it, but the shock that universities have had through COVID, the bashing that their business model has taken. As I think it was Sandra Milligan in Australia said the other day, universities are now trying to find a way to say yes, whereas previously they found a way to say no. Well, this doesn't kind of give a lot of confidence to what this is all about. So I just want to observe that the university's reaction to the way in which learning is acknowledged and recognised is not the be-all and end-all. It's an important part of the picture. But we need to have a bigger societal set of questions, I think, when we ask that, and in particular at the end of secondary school. Well, yeah, it's the end of formal mandatory schooling, so young people deserve a really full statement, which is reliable, which gives people confidence, gives a young person confidence actually about what it is that they have achieved, and something about their potential going forward as well. Now, this is a very, very sophisticated piece of work and way out of my range of expertise. I look forward with real anticipation to the next 3-4 years when I think we will see a flowering of new methods and approaches to assessment, and thank God for it, because it's long overdue.
Valerie, very pleased to hear you reference Sandra Milligan's work, because Sandra is here in Adelaide today working with 20 schools on a project that looks at the learner profile. So we've got a question from Jessica Mason about the multiple ways for young people to demonstrate their learning being an important part of the systemic change. But I suspect that at the moment it's kind of both that and the dominant paradigm, which is sort of narrowly defined in terms of literacy, numeracy, and measured through NAPLAN and PISA and so forth. So any advice to the teachers and the leaders this afternoon, Valerie, around how you manage both of those narratives, if you like, in education?
Yeah, it is about managing two narratives, Peter, you're right. And I want to say, to begin with, I think that teachers should not feel entirely alone. I mean, I can understand if you're working in a school, it's all on you, and this feels like a very heavy burden at the moment to try to navigate this system to reduce, if you like, some of the damage to young people that these high-stakes systems have frankly inflicted. But I think there's help in the wings. You know, there are things going on now at the international level, and your own work in Australia, I say again, is absolutely totemic of that. It's really, really important. But more generally, work within, for example, OECD around the future of PISA should give, I think, some high level of confidence that at the international level, we are trying as a global community to do something about this. And, you know, I sometimes think we'll look back on this period and think back to what we did to, I mean, you know, we look at images of Dickensian schools and think, how could they do that to kids? I mean, what were they thinking, you know? And you feel like we'll look back on our systems of examination assessment, particularly somewhere it's got to absurd limits, like, frankly, in some of the Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, where the damage to mental health, with the wounded victors, as it's been put, you know, they might get victorious in the system, but my God, have they been wounded in the achievements of it. Any case, I digress. We'll look back, I think, on this period and wonder what on earth we thought we were up to and what we were doing. But the international attempts on this, and I'm saying this in order to hopefully to give teachers some sense that, you know, they're not alone in the effort to take PISA. The future of PISA is absolutely under reconsideration by OECD itself. So you can see the signs of this in looking around testing and assessment on collaborative problem solving, on global competence, on how one can make meaningful assessments of the competencies that are outlined in the Education 2030 project, which is very much about, as you put it earlier, knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes, and how you have authentic assessments that capture progression in those domains. So all of that work is going on. And all I can say, I suppose, is for systems like yours, which is highly attuned to those developments, stay tuned, keep contributing, and give your teaching staff and the principals in your schools a sense of confidence that, you know, we can do this, we can get to somewhere that we need to be. And if at the same time we continue to try to build the public will, that we continue to encourage politicians to start to talk a different language, without them feeling that they're committing political harikiri, because it's high stakes stuff for them. You know, it's very easy to be ridiculed by a toxic media who do not understand any of this and do not care. Politicians need to be able to stand up and talk about this and not appear that they're selling their system down the river and everything's going to hell. That, you know, they can give confidence that, yes, this is rigorous, yes, this is world class, and by the way, everybody will benefit if we move in this direction.
Valerie, unfortunately, we're on the clock and we're running out of time. So sadly, for the many people who have been involved in this process this afternoon, we haven't been able to ask all of their questions. But thank you again for sharing your time so generously with us, for sharing your wisdom, and a very special thanks for setting the alarm clock a little bit earlier than you might have otherwise done.
Well, it's so worrying, you know, how dependent are we on these? I was getting ready to go to bed last night and it popped up and it said, South Australia tomorrow, do you want to set an alarm? And I'm thinking, get out my life, you know, I can do it. Anyway, I wouldn't forget, because as you know well, I love working with you guys in South Australia, and I just so hope that we can be together in person in the future, not too distant future.
Thanks, Valerie. Certainly share that hope as well. I just wanted to thank, of course, you for this conversation. I think it's going to resonate so strongly with educators in South Australia and beyond who have joined us today. Of course, I want to thank Chelsea again for fantastic work with the Auslan interpreting and everybody at the Australian Learning Lecture that has made this possible. Thanks heaps. It's been an absolutely fantastic event. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.